Hello, and welcome to the African American Heritage House and the 2020 CHQ Assembly. My name is Errol Davis, and I have the distinct honor and privilege as serving as the chairman of the board of the African American Heritage House here at Chautauqua, or AAHH as we fondly refer to it. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 5th of 7 lectures that the AAH will sponsor this season. The AAHH is a diverse organization which is informed by the African American experience. We here are committed to strengthening Chautauqua, and we do this in a variety of ways by encouraging and certainly welcoming diversity, by fostering honest conversations such as the Mirror Project, and by adding new voices to the programmatic mix, something that we did with great vigor during the 2019 Assembly and something that I believe that we are doing again this season. Today, as we are starting to understand, it is important that we own both our past as well as our present. We in the AAHH are committed to telling the stories that need to be told, primarily from an African American perspective. I encourage all of our viewers to go to our website, aaheritagehouse.org, to learn how you can become involved in our work. We are entirely supported by contributions, and so I want to thank our many friends and supporters for making both last season and this season possible. In particular, I want to thank the Union Pacific Corporation for its underwriting, which assures all of us that the voices of the marginalized and the underserved will be heard both clearly and loudly this season. Without the generosity of our friends and supporters, we would be unable to bring the quality speakers to Chautauqua that we have over the years and are doing so again this season. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for supporting this work. So let me move into the program now. Wealth disparities between the races are pretty well known. The reasons for those disparities, however, are less well known. Often we hear that I have more because I worked harder than you, or just like my dad, and perhaps you didn't work quite as hard as I did. Very seldom do you hear that I have more because the system was designed to give me more. Now, there's probably some truth to both of those views, but let me suggest that the former is believed a lot more than the latter. Today, we will get a bit of insight into the less articulated latter theory. Today's speaker is Dr. George McCarthy, who is president and CEO of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The Lincoln Institute seeks to improve quality of life through the effective use, taxation, and stewardship of land. A nonprofit operating foundation whose origins date to 1946, the Lincoln Institute researches and recommends creative approaches to land as a solution to economic, social, and environmental challenges. Before joining the Lincoln Institute in 2014, Dr. McCarthy directed Metropolitan Opportunity at the Ford Foundation, which sought to provide disadvantaged people better access to good jobs and other opportunities for advancement. They did this by supporting regional planning and coordinated transportation and housing development to alleviate poverty and reduce its concentration, not only in metropolitan areas in the U.S., but also in developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Before taking that position, he administered another program at the Ford Foundation that focused on using home ownership to build assets for low-income families in their communities. Before joining the Ford Foundation, Dr. McCarthy worked as a senior research associate at the Center for Urban and Regional Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. McCarthy truly is a global scholar. He has worked as professor of economics at Bard College, resident scholar at the Jerome Levy Economic Institute, visiting scholar and member of the High Table at King's College of Cambridge University, visiting scholar at the University of Naples, Italy, and research associate at the Center for Social Research in St. Petersburg, Russia. I am honored by his presence here today, and I know that you're going to find his remarks both enjoyable and certainly insightful. However, before we begin today's lecture, our live audience should know that you may submit questions for our live Q&A with Dr. McCarthy through the submission portal at questions.chq.org, which is on your screen at the moment. And you can do this from any mobile or a desktop browser, or if you use Twitter, use the hashtag CHQ2020. Today's remarks were pre-recorded. However, they will be followed by a live Q&A with Dr. McCarthy with questions submitted by our live audience tuning in around the world. My fellow Chautauquans, the AAHH is pleased to present to you Dr. George McCarthy.
Good afternoon. I'm George McCarthy, the President and CEO of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and I'm here to talk to you about my favorite topic, land policy. I really want to thank the African American House of Chautauqua for inviting me here. I really want to get you to understand the complexity of land policy and how it really lives behind a lot of the ways we experience our lives today. So first, let's just get an idea of what land policy is, because most people don't know. Land policy is a subset of the rules of the game that define the relationship between people and place. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we need to find ways to kind of negotiate or navigate between the private interests of individual landowners and the social needs and the collective needs of society. It's a big book of rules. It includes things like, land use planning, zoning. It also includes a set of activities that exploit the land, like taxation, property taxation, or mining, or separating water from land using water rights. And it includes things that we do for larger long-term purposes, like the conservation of land through instruments like conservation easements that help us to preserve land in perpetuity for generations and for endangered species. Land policy at its best helps us to be better. And land policy at its worst reinforces old grudges and makes people a lot worse off. And unfortunately, the topic today is about some bad land policy. So let's get into that. So today I want to talk about how land policy reinforced economic, social, political, and health inequalities based on race in the United States for the last century. And that land policy is really the story of structural racism, and it reflects two major things. How today's maps of cities where we live are defined by policy decisions made almost a century ago, and how, in spite of numerous attempts to address all the inequalities, the inequities that resulted from decisions made a century ago, have been ineffective. And then, hopefully, we can turn our attention to what we're facing now, a global pandemic and an accompanying recession that might rival the Great Depression in its severity, and so we have some decisions to make going forward. So I want to link my talk to the social unrest that we're experiencing now that was really happened in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, St. Paul. It's a horrible moment, and it's a horrible moment that should force us to reflect and force us to understand just how important it is to act correctly now. It's an urgent moment, and it's going to require heroic efforts to deal with not just the situation that we're faced with COVID or with the accompanying recession, but with 90 plus years of structural racism that we built into our land policy systems that actually led in some ways to the murder of George Floyd and many others at the hands of the police. But this isn't something we're going to lay at the feet of the police. This is something we should lay at all of our feet, because this is a public policy decision that we abided for 70, 80, 90 years. Okay, the sub-theme really is about poverty and inequality. And, social scientists like me have been studying poverty and recommending strategies and remedies to poverty and inequality for decades. And the dominant model that we've used is studying poverty as a disease, as if it's something that you can catch. And very often we study that disease by looking at the victims and acting as if we can explain poverty by something that the victims did, some action that the victims took, as if poverty wasn't something that was generated by our own system of laws and policies. The racial wealth divide has grown over the last 3 decades. I'm going to show you these stunning graphs where we show that the average wealth of a white person from 1983 to 2016 grew from $110,000 to $146,000. And then we'll compare that to the average wealth of African Americans. So for blacks, the average wealth in 1983 was $7,000. That was 1/15 of the average wealth of a white household. But today, in 2016, it's $3,500, which is 1/30th of the average wealth of a white household now. And there's a similar story for Latinos. But where does that come from? The wealth differences have to come from somewhere. And as it turns out, it comes from housing, predominantly. If we look at the homeownership rates in the United States, and homeownership accounts for the lion's share of wealth of all households, we'll see that white households today have almost an 80% rate of homeownership, while African Americans' homeownership rate hovers just around 40%. And for Hispanics, for Latinos, the rates hover around 45%. And that gap is significant, but it's even more significant given the fact that the racial gap in homeownership is worse now than it was in 1965 when we passed the Civil Rights Act. We also look at things like life expectancy. The life expectancy of a black male starting in 1970 was about 15 years shorter than the life expectancy of a white female. And even now, today, in 2016, that difference is about 12 or 14 years. And for across race and gender, we see that life expectancy rates for white males, exceeds the life expectancy of black males by 7, 8 years now. The life expectancy of white females exceeds the life expectancy of black females by about 10 years as well. So all of these things are very great at kind of indicating that something is really bad, but they don't really tell the story of where it all came from. And unfortunately, all too often, we spend our time blaming the victims as opposed to looking at kind of what the structures are that create poverty, inequality, and racial inequity. So Act 1, the Great Depression. The Great Depression was the last time we faced a crisis of similar proportions to what we face today with COVID and the accompanying recession. Unemployment rates were extraordinarily high. The problems of displacement of people from their homes, either through eviction or foreclosure, were profound. The banks actually collapsed in 1929 and led to severe problems across the entire economy. New dealers realized that heroic efforts had to be made to find ways to really contain the damage and to preserve two things that really are the character of this country: democracy and the capitalist economy. And if they're going to preserve capitalism and democracy, how are they going to do it? Well, they're going to do it by building the middle class. Building the middle class meant they were going to have to find ways to protect the millions of people who are going to lose their homes through foreclosure, and finding other ways to help the middle class to get a stake in the new economy. How'd they do that? Well, the first thing they did was they created the Homeowner Loan Corporation. The Homeowner Loan Corporation was an entity that was funded with public debt, bonds, and it was used to refinance about 1 million mortgages for people who would otherwise face foreclosure and evictions. Like most legislation during times of any time, there were partisan divides and there were all sorts of issues within Congress that led them to make multiple compromises. And the first was the Congress thought that this was going to be a huge money loser. And so they insisted that they find ways to make sure that the lending that was done through the Homeowner Loan Corporation was done in as safe a way as possible. The other thing was that racists and nativists who were just a part of the Congress and not even ashamed of it were insisting that they did not make handouts to immigrants or to blacks. And so they found ways to make sure that these policies that they enacted to build the middle class basically excluded minorities and blacks on the way. So the Homeowner Loan Corporation refinanced $3 billion worth of loans, which is equivalent to about $1 trillion today. And they pioneered the self-amortizing mortgage so that a family could actually buy their home and own it in 25 years because the principal would reduce. Before that, a mortgage for a house was a 5-year mortgage. It was an interest-only loan, and most people had to refinance every 5 years with the bank their loans. Now, when they came to the banks and the banks had failed to refinance their loans after 5 years, the banks didn't have the money. They wanted them to pay off what was left of their balance. In order to expand home ownership and make it possible for other people to have homes, the New Dealers created the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. And the FHA was basically backed by the good faith of the U.S. government. It allowed people to buy homes through regular banks, and the FHA insured the mortgages and made sure that the banks would be made whole in the event that the people didn't pay their mortgages. These two programs helped millions of people to buy their homes through the 1940s or to preserve their homes, and it helped many of them to build wealth. And as you saw before, the wealth that was built through home ownership is the predominant wealth clearly of the middle class. But the government didn't extend these opportunities to everyone. And in fact, in order to make sure that the loans that they made through the Homeowner Loan Corporation were done safely, they sent teams of federal agents to all the different cities in the United States to talk to local real estate agents and bankers to decide where and to whom they should lend. The programs built secret maps of the cities where they color-coded the different neighborhoods based on red, yellow, blue, and green, red being hazardous, to decide whether or not they should be extending loans to those areas. Those maps were kept secret from the 1930s to the 1970s when a historian found them in the National Archives and disclosed them to all of us. But for some reason or other, that's the 1970s, it's still not kind of a well-known fact. And one of the big problems with the way this happened was, all of a sudden what we did is we had national policy reinforcing local policies that were segregationist and racist. And it was kind of the first time we started to see this alignment between national, state, local policy, all for the wrong reasons. So I'm going to show you one of these maps. And this is a map of Cleveland, Ohio. And I use Cleveland because I know so many of you Chautauquans are from Cleveland. And so you might be able to identify some of the neighborhoods on this map. If you look at the red neighborhoods on the map, St. Clair, Superior, Huff, Kinsmith, Fairfax, Glenville, Central, Slavic Village. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see where those might be. And I'm going to note that, Bracknell and Shaker Heights are blue and green. So where do you think the Homeowner Loan Corporation was going to be willing to refinance homes for people who were going to lose them to foreclosure? In Bracknell and Shaker Heights and some of the, even possibly some of the yellow areas, but certainly not in Huff or Central or Glenville. And so they helped to maintain a level of segregation in Cleveland that we still see today. This is Miami. And in Miami, these are going to be important later because I'm going to talk about other land policy decisions that matter when we start looking at these maps. If you look at the red areas on the map of Miami, the largest red area in the center of the map is an area called Overtown. Overtown was one of the oldest African-American communities in the United States. Well known as a destination for musicians, for artists, and lots of people went there to enjoy kind of the output of the artists and the musicians and to sample the food and all that. This is New Orleans, and you see most of New Orleans is red, which kind of indicates the character, the demographic character of New Orleans. One important point to keep in mind as we're thinking about the New Deal with the FHA, with the Homeowner Loan Corporation, is that this national policies did not arise out of a vacuum, and they reflected things that were already going on the ground. And so if you look at some of the trade organizations that also were kind of important in land policy during the 1930s, like the National Association of Real Estate Boards. This is a quote from their Code of Ethics. They said, "A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in the neighborhood." That's the realtors, right? And so according to Kenneth Jackson, the historian, he said the Homeowner Loan Corporation, the FHA, devised a rating system that undervalued neighborhoods that were dense, mixing, or aged, and applied existing notions of ethnic and racial worth to real estate appraising on an unprecedented scale. That's the key. Because all they did was they reflected practice in now national policy, reflected practices that are already going on the ground. Banks wouldn't make loans in those neighborhoods already. But now the FHA said, we're not going to insure loans in those neighborhoods. So this is another slide that I just offer for you because this tells you how the locals were thinking. And this is St. Paul, Minnesota, part of Minneapolis, St. Paul. And it's a map of basically the neighborhoods produced by the local planning board. And if you look, the brown neighborhoods are all labeled slums. The key to these, and I apologize for the language, but it's, you know, slums with Negroes, slums with Jews, slums with Italians, right? They're dotted all around. They're just well-known areas, and they're unashamed at calling out kind of the racial composition of the neighborhood. And then, of course, if you look at that nice gold area below, it's called the Gold Coast of St. Paul. But this is how the locals saw their area. And then what did we do? We formalized that in the actual map, the secret maps produced by the Homeowner Loan Corporation, which is what you see on your screen here. That one slum that said the oldest Negro settlement in St. Paul is labeled D4 on this map, and is also known as Rondo. Rondo was historically a mixed-race neighborhood from the beginning of St. Paul. It was known to be a destination, but it was a middle-class destination with thriving businesses, a well-knit neighborhood that kind of protected itself. It was also home to many famous artists, including August Wilson, the playwright. This is what happened. And if you look at any map, and this is just one area, I'm zooming into Minneapolis-St. Paul because, of course, Minneapolis-St. Paul is where the murder of George Floyd sparked all the civil unrest we're seeing now. But if you look at this map or the hundreds of other maps that are made by the Homeowner Loan Corporation, they still reflect settlement patterns that we see today. So Act 2 is the rest of the 20th century, and it's going to talk about how the initial decisions that we made during the Great Depression to create the Homeowner Loan Corporation, to build the FHA, and to decide where we're going to lend ended up shaping the way we live in cities for the next century. And part of that story is the story of starvation of capital to communities that cannot find ways to finance businesses, to finance homes, to finance even, you know, basic infrastructure. And it's also the story of how other land policy decisions become a cascading set of events that basically decimated the African American community and made sure that they were going to remain poor throughout the 20th century and well into the 21st century. So, for example, you know, after World War II, the GI Bill introduced the VA mortgage, and supposedly it was going to give a leg up to veterans who needed to build wealth, start a family, and join the middle class, except that the VA adopted the FHA appraisal standards that already said that you cannot make a loan in places in which undesirable people are likely to invade the neighborhood. Undesirable meaning, of course, African Americans or other ethnic groups like Southern Europeans and Jews, right? Major infrastructure that was built in the 1970s, particularly the interstate highway system, was going to find its way into these poor communities that were already starved of capital, and now they're going to be underserved in other ways. And then urban renewal and the construction of subsidized and affordable housing is also just going to layer on top of all these other decisions additional burdens on those neighborhoods in places in which we didn't really need affordable housing. We needed affordable housing in the wealthy suburbs, but the wealthy suburbs didn't want affordable housing. And I'm going to do this through a deep dive in Minneapolis-St. Paul because, as I said, it's iconic now because of George Floyd and how all the cascading set of events after COVID have kind of laid out. But in this case, it's not just about George Floyd. It's not just about Minneapolis-St. Paul. It's about 1,000 places just like it, right? So just keep that in mind. So the interstate highway system. The interstate highway system was one of the largest infrastructure projects in the world in the 20th century. We built thousands of miles of interstate highways across the United States, and it was mostly predicated on military. It was a Cold War decision. We wanted to be able to move armies and missiles and stuff across the United States in short term, but it was also sold to the American public as a gigantic economic development opportunity because it was going to position the United States as an economic power. But where do we build the highways when we came to the cities in the U.S.? And unfortunately, we decided to build the highways in places where the land was cheap. Now let's imagine for a minute, where would land be cheap in cities? Maybe in the same places where capital wouldn't flow into the cities to improve the land, to have people own their homes, to see other improved services. And indeed, they were. They were the exact same places that we starved of capital. It's the exact same places that we herded minorities and immigrants into because we didn't want them to live in other places in our cities. So on top of kind of the abuse of not being lent to, on top of the abuse of not being served by other kinds of policies, we decided that we're going to cleave all of our middle-class African-American neighborhoods with superhighways. And so in Overtown, one of the oldest African-American communities in the U.S., we displaced 10,000 households to build the interstate highway system, and predominantly owned by people of color, right? In Treme, in New Orleans, planners and activists are now advocating for taking down the I-10, which cleaved the whole Claiborne corridor across Treme, across the 7th Ward, and across St. Roch, right? All African-American middle-class communities. And so I'll just show you on the map. I drew these roads myself, but this is Miami. And as you see, not only did they cleave, the main red area from the Hulk map, known as Overtown, but they decided to put overpasses and connectors for I-95, I-195, and I-395 right on top of those areas. In New Orleans, they directed these. You couldn't have been more intentional. They directed the highways, I-10 and Route 90, right through these neighborhoods that are red because they are deemed hazardous by the Homeowner Loan Corporation and not served by the FHA. And it's not even the best route to go through New Orleans. It's not an efficient route. They just decided to go through these areas and take down the Claiborne corridor, which at the time was, once again, a thriving middle-class African-American commercial district. And the planner's logic, you build where the land is cheap. It's hard to deny, but is it really true? And so if we take a deeper dive into Minneapolis, St. Paul, the planners there decided to drive I-94 right through Rondo, the social, cultural, and historic center of St. Paul, rather than use a nearby abandoned railroad corridor, right, a right-of-way that the railroads had. And that project displaced 600 families from their homes and shuttered 300 businesses on Rondo Avenue. Dozens of cross streets were turned into cul-de-sacs, and now kids couldn't get to school because they couldn't cross the right-of-way that was made by the highway cutting through Minneapolis, St. Paul. And just to give you some statistics, because I know you all really are dying for statistics, if you look at where freeways were built relative to the Homeowner Loan Corporation areas in Minneapolis, 47% of the land of highways went into the red hazardous zones that the Homeowner Loan Corporation wouldn't lend to, even though that only represented 16.8% of the land. That's like a 3-to-1 ratio, right? And if you go to of course, to the green areas, the green areas account for 14% of the land in Minneapolis, St. Paul, but it only took 7% of the highways. Or, the blue areas, 39% of Minneapolis is in the blue areas, and only 22% of the highways went through those blue areas. So as you can see, St. Paul in the same way, the red stacks are the amount of highways that went into those areas, and the blue stacks are the amount of land in St. Paul represented by those areas. And you see, St. Paul is even much worse than Minneapolis, where 13.9% of St. Paul is considered to be the most desirable, the best area, and only 0.2% of the highways went through those areas, while 56% of the highways went through the red zones like Rondo. And just to show you, this is back to that map that shows you the different neighborhoods from 1935, and you can see I-94 cutting right through that's the section that's labeled Negroes. And if you wonder, very often we think about highways as lines on maps. But if you want to see what the scarring that a highway does to an urban neighborhood, this is what it looked like when I-94 went through St. Paul. And on the right is actually Rondo Ave. And on the left, I can't think of the name of the road, but there were 2 whole city blocks between those 2 roads that were completely destroyed and taken out. And imagine that you have your church on one side and you live on the other side. How are you going to get to church? You're going to walk an extra mile to go over an overpass to get around through that right-of-way. Urban renewal, which was basically related to the efforts to upgrade slums, also called slum clearance in a lot of places, right, was a second way that we use land policy to kind of define the way we lived in cities. And so basically with urban renewal, we would identify an area, we say this area it needs to be fixed up, and we'd use eminent domain, and we would take the property from whoever owned that property in that area, and we'd pay them what was considered to be a fair price for that property. But if that property had been starved for capital for decades, it's not going to be worth very much. And so in urban renewal, what we do is we take the property away from people and we'd rebuild it, but we wouldn't give the rebuilt property back to the original folks. We would have them go find new places to live in basically segregated cities. And so in Minneapolis, 29% of the folks displaced by urban renewal between 1950 and 1966 were families of color, even though they only represented 3% of the city's population. 3% of the city's population, 29% of those displaced, right? And then just another example, because Minneapolis-St. Paul isn't the only place we're talking about this. In Glynn County, Georgia, where Ahmaud Arbery was killed while jogging, 93% of the household displaced by urban renewal were families of color, although they made up only 1/3 of the population. So the NAACP during the 1940s and 50s called urban renewal Negro removal for a good reason, right? And then what did we do when we renewed these areas? Well, very often we built subsidized housing. And subsidized housing, first we started with slum clearance, we built public housing. We built about 2 million units of public housing in what were formerly slums. On a one-for-one basis, we'd demolish a slum dwelling and we'd replace it with a public housing dwelling. And the public housing we built, we later decided wasn't working. And in the 1980s, we decided that the only solution was to blow it up and replace it with other kinds of housing. In the 1980s, when we decided that public housing wasn't working and we blew it up, we also, of course, blamed the victims because we said the reason public housing didn't work is because we had too many dysfunctional families living in them and they let the buildings deteriorate around them, as if anybody who rents a building should be responsible for maintaining that building. So we built 2 million units of public housing, and then we moved to market-based solutions in the 1980s with the low-income housing tax credit. And guess where we built low-income housing tax credit units? In the same neighborhoods that we wouldn't lend for the Homeowner Loan Corporation, the same neighborhoods we wouldn't lend for the FHA, the same neighborhoods that we denied every other kind of amenity that others living in cities deserved. And so just to give you, once again, another example, this might be hard to see, and hopefully this will render on your screens. This is where we built low-income housing tax credit housing in Minneapolis-St. Paul. And if you look on the right of that screen, and I'm going to zoom in a second, the right of that screen, that dark shaded area, the darker the green, the higher the density of African Americans, and every one of the orange dots is a low-income housing tax credit. On the right of the screen is Rondo. On the left of the screen is inner Minneapolis, which is also an area that wouldn't be served by the Homeowner Loan Corporation. So if we zoom into Minneapolis, you can see a little bit better here that the dark green areas are the areas that almost solely get the low-income housing tax credit units. And then if we look over to the Rondo area, you see Old Rondo Ave, University Ave. Almost all the low-income housing tax credit units in St. Paul are in Rondo. And maybe a little bit easier map to understand this. This is Cleveland. You can see where we decided to build low-income housing tax credit in Cleveland. The darker brown areas are the areas with higher densities of minorities. Or Boston, my hometown. This is where we decided to build low-income housing tax credits in Boston. And don't be fooled by these few, like out in Brookline, that look like they have low-income housing tax credits for low-income people. Those are low-income housing tax credits for elderly. They're elder care facilities that were built using low-income housing tax credits. But the point being here that, of course, this is just an example of this cascading set of land policy decisions. And of course, this didn't happen without notice. The NAACP in 1938 complained about the Homeowner Loan Corporation, the FHA, but it fell on deaf ears. And then finally, in the 1950s, as we began to really understand how it was that the way people were being settled, the way we were offering them different kinds of amenities like schools needed to be addressed, we desegregated the schools in 1956 after the famous Brown versus Board of Education. In 1964, we passed the Civil Rights Act. And the Civil Rights Act was supposed to level the playing field in terms of public policy regarding race. In 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act, and that was the first time we started to examine the underwriting standards of the FHA, and we decided that those were illegal. In 1976, we passed the Community Reinvestment Act because we said redlining was illegal, and it was wrong for banks not to lend in certain areas because of the racial composition of those neighborhoods. And we made banks make an affirmative commitment to serve the lending needs of the populations in the areas that they served, in all the areas that they served. And there were dozens of other precedent-setting court decisions and presidential executive orders. But the point is that all of those things that happened in the 20th century didn't make a dent on the inequities, particularly the racial inequities, that we still experience today in 1920. This is Act 3, the 21st century, and I want to talk about the enduring economic and demographic impact of those land policy decisions, starting with the Homeowner Loan Corporation, going to the FHA, the VA, and all the different urban renewal, the interstate highway system, and probably a dozen other kinds of decisions made, that today we can still see the evidence of those decisions and how it's experienced by the people living in those neighborhoods. So in that former Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul, just north of I-94, the population is 57% black, and the average income is $55,000. Less than a mile south in the Grand Avenue neighborhood, the one I talked about that said Gold Coast on that map of St. Paul, the population is 81% white, and the median income is $119,000, twice as much as in Rondo. But even more troubling for me and really more striking, on Grand Avenue, which by the way was ranked by Forbes magazine as one of the 10 prettiest neighborhoods in America, life expectancy is 84 years old. That's 10 years longer than in the Rondo neighborhood where life expectancy is 74. 1 mile equals 10 years of life. You know, neighborhoods offer vastly different access to schools, healthcare, career ladders, other kinds of opportunity that play themselves out in measurable statistics that we can look at by race, right? So for example, I mean, these things just baffle me, but so researchers have studied heat islands in cities, right? Heat islands in cities are areas of cities that are much hotter than the area around it. They found that one of the highest heat disparities was in Minneapolis, St. Paul, where the Rondo area was 11 degrees hotter on hot days than that area, the Grand Avenue area, a mile south. Heat is actually the largest weather-related killer in the United States. It kills more people than tornadoes and hurricanes and lightning and everything else. And nationally, they look now across all the different homeownership loan corporation maps, right? And they found, on average, neighborhoods that were shaded red in the HOLC maps were 4.7 degrees warmer than neighborhoods once shaded in green. Now, why are those neighborhoods hotter than the neighborhoods that are shaded in green? Well, the neighborhoods shaded in green are also green. They have trees. They have other kinds of nice amenities that actually shield them from open pavement and development that exposes the land to the sun and to the heat. The mortality rates from COVID-19 indicate that black Americans are 2.4 times more likely to die from the disease than white Americans. And it stuns me when we hear the pundits on the television talking about it, because they usually cite, underlying health conditions, lack of access to health care, rather than decades worth of basically race war being played out in different ways. It's just a new kind of indicator, a new measurement of racial inequity played out over generations and now exposing people to higher degrees of mortality. So where do you think people are exposed to pollution? Oh, gee, I don't know. But let's take a look at Rondo in Minneapolis, St. Paul. This is race and brownfields. And you know, brownfields are areas that have been exposed to pollutants and need to have environmental cleanup because they're toxic, right? Well, that big purple area in the middle of the map is Rondo, and it just happens to be surrounded by brownfields. So, and not only are they surrounded by brownfields, but they have a superhighway going right through the middle, which exposes people to all of the associated problems of, exhaust fumes from cars. So in the 21st century, we also had a thing called the Great Recession. And the Great Recession was, thought to be kind of the once-in-a-century kind of economic downturn. It was, of course, associated with really, really bad behavior by banks, particularly surrounding race, where they were extending credit at really bad terms to people who had very little chance of repaying it, and then foreclosing on them and taking their homes away. When it finally hit, the U.S. housing system somehow was in a position to really bring down the entire world economy. And when it brought down the world economy, the federal government stepped in to save both our financial system and the global financial system by pumping trillions of dollars into investment banks, insurance companies, and other public companies like, the big motor companies, GM and Ford, right? But they stood by idly as the wealth of minorities evaporated. So after the Great Recession, with a gigantic foreclosure boom, from 2005 to 2009, according to Pew, median wealth fell by 66% among Hispanic households, 53% among black households, and just 16% for white households. So let's revisit that. 66%, two-thirds of the wealth of Hispanic households evaporated in 4 years. 53% of the meager wealth of black households evaporated in 4 years. And for white households, only 16% of it evaporated. And interestingly enough, most of that was made up in the 4 years following for the white households, not for the minorities. And of course, homeownership rates fell precipitously for minorities. And homeownership rates, they're really bad by race everywhere, but in some places they're really, really bad. And unfortunately, here's another case in which Minneapolis-St. Paul leads the nation. The gap in homeownership rates in Minneapolis-St. Paul are the highest for any metro area in the country. White homeownership rates are 76.3%, and black homeownership rates in Minneapolis-St. Paul, the entire metro, are 25.2%, or a 51% difference. In Milwaukee, it's bad too. 70% of whites own homes, while 27.4% of blacks own homes, a 42% difference. This tells a story, but it doesn't tell you how we got there. And how we got there, hopefully if you believe me, is through a cascading set of land policies starting in the Great Depression in 1933 and leading us to this kind of bad point now where we have these incredible disparities and almost no ideas about what to do. And wrapping it up, I just need to get people to think really, really carefully about the moment we're faced with now. COVID-19, we haven't solved it. COVID-19 is still with us, and it's going to be with us for a while. And it's likely that COVID-19 is going to lead to an ever-deepening recession, if not a depression. We've already got 30 million U.S. workers out of a job, and it doesn't look like the economy is going to spark to life very much sooner. Are we going to make, under duress, make decisions that make compromises that allow us to disadvantage people who have been disadvantaged for decades, generations, centuries? Or are we actually going to finally do the thing that we should do, which is to confront the inequalities that we've built into our systems for 90 or 100 years by going really, really aggressively affirmative in how we stimulate the economy after we solve COVID? And this is one of those things that I think it hangs in the balance, and right now the balance doesn't look good, especially when we have people in Congress talking about the idea that, we can't reward people for not working by giving them some spending money that might help them pay their rent, but might pay them more than they were being paid when they were working. And they're acting as if people will voluntarily stop working just because they're getting rewarded more, as opposed to the fact that maybe the work they were doing put them and their families at risk in the first place. And the $600 that the federal government gives them as part of the stimulus is not really the thing that weighs in the balance between whether they go back to work or not. Maybe they have kids at home they have to manage. Maybe they have elderly parents that they have to care for. Who knows what the story is? But the story that's being told now, very much like the story that was told during the Great Depression, is we can't be giving handouts to people who don't deserve them, right? While we give, I don't know how many billions of dollars to Boeing, who decided they were going to kill hundreds of people because they falsified tests on their aircraft. The way we explain inequality and poverty and inequity matters. And we can't treat poverty like it's a disease that you contract. We have to really understand that poverty is actually produced by a system, a rules of the game, the way we actually conduct business in this country. And if we keep producing the poor, and the poor end up being minorities, black minorities, Hispanic minorities, other immigrants that we bring in, then all we're going to do is keep repeating this cycle over and over and over again. Even worse, we can't allow local land use policies to I hate to use the word, to trump our needs to do better in terms of better spatial distribution of things like affordable housing. Can we allow rich suburbs to do exclusionary zoning and not permit the building of low-income housing in their areas? We do now because we say land use policy really lives locally, and we need the states and we need the federal government to step up and say no. We need to find ways to put people where the opportunity is. We need to make it possible for the people who do the work in these wealthy communities to live in those same communities. And we had to learn the other lesson that we failed to learn during the 1960s, and we continue to fail to learn, I think, which is that once the scales have been tipped, and once the scales have been tipped really, really badly, then the policy response can't be to level the playing field. Because if you level the playing field and one person's playing up here and the other person's playing down there, the field doesn't get leveled, right? So with the desegregation of schools, with the Civil Rights Act, with the Fair Housing Act, every one of them said, oh, we're just gonna level the playing field so that everybody gets treated equally. But you can't treat people equally now when you've mistreated them for 90 years. We have to find ways to actually be affirmative and actually target all of our subsidies, target all of our stimulus to the people who need it the most. That's going to be a tough sell, and it's going to be a tough sell not just in Congress, but even with the American people who already feel besieged. We're the wealthiest country in the world. We can afford it, but we just need to figure out a way to build the right kind of political will. And we can't let this excuse that the moment is so urgent that we can't construct the right kind of policy. We can't let people say, oh no, we can't give handouts to the wrong people while we give gigantic handouts to, oh, I don't know, it was AIG during the Great Recession and now it's Boeing this time, or whether it's Ford or GM or whoever else is going to get the giant sums of money, and the small pieces go to people that we then denigrate and say they don't deserve it, right? And we can't take the actions like we took in the Great Depression, which is to just sit by and watch while bad things happen. I have plenty of other kinds of observations to offer, and I really do look forward to our discussion, the questions and answers after this. But I just want to take this opportunity to thank you again for your time and attention, and I hope that we have a fulsome discussion following this presentation. So thank you very much.
All I can say is, wow. Thank you for that stunningly insightful and certainly educational presentation. The one thing I certainly will take away is that poverty is not a disease, poverty is a system, and perhaps the next time I and some of my friends look at a slum, we don't say, how can people live like that? Perhaps we can say, why did we allow this to happen, and what can we do about it? I would like to say that this was a very upbeat and encouraging presentation, but it was a tad discouraging for me. And so I have to ask, before I go to all the questions, and I have lots and lots of them, are there any policies that have worked to rebalance the playing field? And if so, how did they work?
Well, first, Errol, let me thank you and the AAH for giving me this chance to talk to you. And all I can say is someone's going to tell that guy to slow down and take a breath. So it's really painful to watch yourself on the screen, and I hope everybody that's listening gets a chance to do the same, to watch themselves on the screen so they can be sympathetic. So One of the things that I was probably more negative about than I should have been is that not all of the efforts that we made to address, especially the flow of capital and the wealth disparities, were ill-conceived. It's more that they were not actually enforced. They weren't implemented well. And so, for example, the Fair Housing Act in 1969 was a well thought through act, and it did do a lot to examine the way that we did lending, the way that we offered housing to people, the way that we steered people racially, and it forbid a lot of the really, really bad practices. The problem was that it was only enforced through litigation. And so the only way that people were caught doing bad things around the Fair Housing Act were when mostly kind of public service attorneys were running around defending people from being discriminated against in housing choices or in lending markets, and they were able to put together, some really clear evidence that someone was doing the discriminating, and then they would have multi-million-dollar lawsuits that were settled. But that's like guerrilla warfare, where you look at a large field and you just start picking off one. It's like it's being a sniper. You take one thing at a time, but it never addresses kind of the underlying circumstances. And we knew for a long time that the way we did fair housing through public policy wasn't sufficient for really addressing a lot of those problems. And over the decades, we got a little bit better and a little bit better. And then with Obama, they actually decided that they were going to add some regulatory heft to fair housing. And they passed this affirmatively furthering fair housing, which was actually going to give HUD the ability to regulate where and how we built affordable housing, to make sure that when you looked at a regional area, that the wealthy areas in regions, the wealthy suburbs, were taking their fair share of affordable housing development, as opposed to being able to exclude it. Unfortunately, a couple of weeks ago, that affirmatively furthering fair housing was struck down by the Trump administration, and it's been kind of removed. And it didn't really have a chance to be really fully enforced. The same thing with the Community Reinvestment Act. The Community Reinvestment Act actually imposed an affirmative commitment to banks to serve all the areas, all the geography in which they did business. And metrics were developed to kind of measure the quality of the service they gave, the amount of lending they did in different areas. And the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act was created to force them to report on where they were doing their lending and how they were lending. Unfortunately, the CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, was passed in 1976, and it was first enforced in 1989. So it took 13 years for any enforcement, and the only way it was actually ever enforced was by blocking the merger of banks. So the only time they even examined the lending record of banks was when a bank was proposing to merge with another bank. Luckily for us, banks like to merge, right? And so there's a lot of merger, efforts going on. And so it gave people a chance to try to, scrutinize their lending behavior. And banks did take CRA seriously for at least a couple of decades. But then, starting with the Great Recession, the CRA has become, fairly weak, and it has never been aggressively enforced. It's only been enforced kind of in a passive way, so that it didn't actually result in as much kind of remedy as we'd hoped when we originally passed it.
Thank you. Speaking of individuals who have been subjected to fair housing suits, let me relate to you what the president said this morning, and he tweeted that suburban housewives are thrilled that I ended the long-running program where low-income housing would invade their neighborhood. I'm not sure that's a question or whether you want to dignify that for a response, but I just wanted to let you know that's what our president tweeted this morning. For years, I ran a utility company. And so I'm interested, and I should say I was in the affordable housing business as well. How can you talk about how public utilities factor into land policy?
Well, public utilities, they control an awful lot of land. And what they do with that land and how they manage that land is something that's not very transparent. A lot of they get very little kind of community input in terms of a lot of the decisions they make, and so they're not as accountable as they should be. And so, depending on the utility, and so if you include things like transit systems within the list of utilities, in a lot of states, the public transportation systems are the largest landowners in the state. And one of the things that I spent a good 10 years of my life doing was trying to advocate for ways that we could link up the behavior of utilities like public transit, but also utilities like energy companies, to take seriously the role that they would play in producing and preserving affordable housing. And I would have to say that for the first in those 10 years that I worked on it, for the first 8 years, we had very little success. And then after they passed Proposition 32 and SB 375 in California, where the state finally said, you have to take seriously the idea that these public utilities, particularly the transit agencies, play a big role in connecting people to opportunity. And you have to think about co-locating affordable housing where we're going to build transit stations. You have to think about using your energy money, your public benefit money, to help low-income families to meet their energy bills. Only then did that start being taken seriously, and that was only, about 7 or 8, 9 years ago. And now the utilities are getting really serious about finding ways to work in new local coalitions to improve areas, to change the way areas are developed, and to make sure that when they redevelop areas, they don't displace the low-income families living in those areas. One of our big, we're working with water utilities, we're working with port authorities in different cities, and they're finally realizing that they can actually do something really meaningful in addressing affordable housing shortages in those cities. And mostly because they control land, but also because they control lots of other kinds of resources. Yeah.
We are about to see an end to the moratorium on evictions. And from a public policy perspective, first, do you think that you're going to see a surge? And two, do you have any innovative ideas on what can be done to avoid these mass evictions?
Yeah, so my concern is that, yes, number one, we are going to see a massive wave of evictions, particularly because even the protections that are put in by national policy only apply to housing that has some kind of either a federal guarantee or is provided some kind of subsidy by the federal government. So it's either insured by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, the FHA, or it's got some other kinds of tax credit or something associated with it. Turns out that's only about 25% of the housing in the U.S. The other 75% isn't going to be protected. And we've had if you've read Matt Desmond, we've already had this cascading, this gigantic growing problem with eviction in the U.S. And if this does happen, it runs the risk of doing several things, but not least of which actually, once again, imperiling the housing finance system in the U.S., which risks the world finance system if it really collapses again, right? And so you don't have to be a genius to be innovative about this, because basically the thing that keeps the housing finance system going, the lifeblood of housing finance system, is a liquidity that flows in through rental payments and mortgage payments. And some of my more progressive friends in the affordable housing industry have realized that the best thing they can do to avoid having to evict their tenants is to give their tenants zero interest loans to pay their rent, and not to have that all of a sudden come due as a lump at the time when they finally get their money back, but to give them a period of time to pay it back in a relatively painless way. And then they keep the investors happy, they keep the banks happy, and they keep their tenants in place, so they don't have to go through all the other kinds of difficulties of trying to replace tenants in a really, really difficult market, right? And so the idea is, if you keep warm bodies in the houses, right, then you can deal with the the economic ramifications later. And part of it might be to say, just like we're saying it with a PPP, right? If we give loans to businesses to pay their workers, and if they don't lay off their workers, we'll forgive the loans. Why don't we give the loans to landlords to pay the rent for their renters? And if they keep their renters in place and don't displace them, we might forgive the loans, or we might forgive part of the loans and get them to work with their renters to actually pay off their arrearages over a longer period of time. It's humane and it's easily done, right? But it's just something that, of course, we don't want to do, because the people who would benefit from it are people who are typically poor and politically powerless and aren't going to, be able to do very much about it if we don't protect them, right?
Thank you for that very insightful answer. You spoke earlier about policies which sought to level the playing field, and you made the point that they generally just said, let's treat everybody equally on playing fields which were unlevel. Now, one of the questioners seems to think that that's becoming perilously close to the hot word of reparations, and which we will have a talk on next week. But again, do you think these statistics help people to think about the issue of reparations and to give some definition to reparations other than just saying it's a handout and you're taking money from me and giving it to you?
Oh, absolutely. Actually, and I think that there is a case to be made for reparations. And in fact, I don't know if you're going to have Sandy Darity or Kirsten Mullen talking.
That's exactly who we're having next week.
Oh, they made a very compelling case. And in fact, their history goes back to the Civil War. Mine only goes back to the Depression, but it's the same thing. It's how land and other markets and other public policies played out to basically rob African Americans of all resources that would have been theirs now in this point in history. And so at some point, you have to find a way to make some form of reparation, and how you do it probably matters. But I think that their argument is very, very compelling. And we'll talk about Greenwood, and you'll talk about Rosewood, and you'll talk about all those what we call the race riots that actually displaced whole African American communities from their land. We'll talk about the ways that the 40 acres and a mule, the land that was given to the freed slaves, was whittled away and taken back from them over the course of time. And then it's all the other policies that were enacted that just locked people out from the greatest growth of wealth in the history of the world, which was in the United States from 1944 to 1965. That 20 years when we built the middle class, we gave it away to white people because of the rules of the game, right? So there's every reason to say, yeah, some repair should be made, and that repair can't be treating everybody equal now. It's got to be, what do we do? How do we find a way to, number one, how do we close the home ownership gap between whites and African American? It doesn't actually take that much. It doesn't take as much as one of our stimulus packages that we just signed in the last month or 2 months. So it can be done. It's whether or not the political will is there to do it, and whether or not people understand that there is a reason that one wants to do what we might call, retributive justice, right? Because this injustice that's gone on, from my point, from 1933 on, from Sandy Darity's point, from the Civil War on, and even probably before that, from slavery on, then it's a reasonable thing to expect. But here's the problem: where it's going to collide is with the fact that the machine of the economy doesn't just produce racial inequality; it also produces poverty, and it produces poverty for a growing number of people. And now the stress of the poverty that's created by this, our economy, especially as it deindustrialized over the last 50 years, has been visited now onto that middle class that was so successful from 1945 to 1965, and they're going to become oppositional because they're going to say, you're treating somebody else better than us, and we're suffering too, right? That's going to be true, but that's something else that needs to be navigated by somebody who understands how to navigate public policy and to have the right kind of conversation in a difficult time. And we just don't seem to have right now leadership that's able to do that, right?
Well, I'm not going to comment on today's leadership. We'd be here for too long. Has the Lincoln Institute done work with regard to land policy and Native American populations?
Yes, we have. And it's just another case in which you could make a very strong argument for reparations. One of our most recent work, though, is on land and water policy, and in the arid areas of the American West, particularly in the Colorado Basin, the most senior claim on the water of the Colorado River goes to the Native Americans. But the rules of the game state that they can only take the water that they use, and the water they have claim on that they don't use goes to the next user. So we haven't allowed them to sell their water rights to others to use to irrigate crops in Southern California or in the San Fernando Valley. We don't allow them to sell the water rights that they have in Arizona, in Colorado, or New Mexico to people in Arizona who need more water, while we allow every other private owner of water rights to sell water openly on a water market. And we claim the reason that we don't do that is because we treat Native Americans like a sovereign state. So when we don't want to do something for them, we call them a sovereign independent state. But when we do want to do something for them, like take away their land and move them to a new area, we don't recognize their sovereignty at all, right? So there's of course, books have been written, and more books will be written about kind of what we've done to Native Americans. But it's been, one of those other shameful things that we as Americans don't yet own as our own heritage and legacy, right?
Let me switch back to Minneapolis and St. Paul for a moment. And we had a question which says, what can they do? What can they do today to correct the damage done by this history of racist land use policy? What advice and specific actions do you give to the city fathers of Minneapolis and St. Paul?
Well, the first thing is that you can't just address the issues of race and inequity within the boundaries of Minneapolis, St. Paul anymore, because that's now a metro area that has grown considerably larger than the small city footprint that it was, let's say, in 1933 or in the 50s when they built the highway system. And what that means is you have to say now the region has to solve its problems together. And why that's important is because the people in the region and a lot of the wealthy people who lived in Minneapolis, St. Paul in the 30s and 40s and 50s, they ran off to the suburbs, right? Aided and abetted by public policy, right? Because when we built those interstate highways, what did we do? We opened up new lands for people who could buy big houses on big lots, who could still work in the city, and they could still enjoy all the benefits of being homeowners, like these incredible mortgage interest tax deductions, right? And so they bear some of the burden that we created in the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, but they're like in separate jurisdictions. And so the answer to this is we can't allow local land use to dominate all of our decisions when the individual localities are too small, and they'll make decisions that are too narrowly defined by their own special interests, their own local interests, when we need to deal with the interests of the entire region. And so the answer is you start putting affordable and subsidized housing out in the rich suburbs. You start making them, bear their share of the burden of educating and providing decent housing opportunities and the amenities that go with living in wealthier areas to everybody. And so you don't have the poor minorities migrating from North Minneapolis out to Falcon Heights to clean someone's house and going back and forth. You find a way to make sure that someone can live in Falcon Heights who does house cleaning, and you build that housing and you make it available for them to buy it, so that they can enjoy the benefits of home ownership and wealth building over time like everybody else did. And it's not going to be free, and it's not going to be easy. And it means that people are going to have to give up some expensive land that is expensive because they've been able to exclude people from it, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, we are often, I think, guided by myths. And one of the myths, of course, is that all of these things are zero-sum games. If you make your life better, you're going to make my life worse. Do we see any evidence of this materially happening anywhere?
You mean you mean a positive sum game?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, let's talk about the Great Depression for a minute, because one of the things everybody's going to obsess over is the fact that what you do to build your way out of a horrible economic circumstance is expensive and risky, right? And during the Great Depression, when they created all the alphabet programs, the WPA, the FHA, all the things that they did to kind of employ people, invest in infrastructure, do all the things that we did during the Great Depression, we doubled the national debt in 6 years. Now, doubling the national debt was looked at very, very negatively by a lot of people, especially the penny pinchers in Congress. And they said, how the heck are we going to be able to dig ourselves out of that, right? Well, then we entered World War II. What did we do during World War II? We more than doubled the debt again, right? So how all of a sudden now we take the national debt, we quadruple it, we multiply it by 5, right? And how do we pay it back? Well, we pay it back almost painlessly through the enormous growth that we went through for the next 2 decades that was based on the infrastructure investments and all the other things that we did during the Great Depression. And we did it with very progressive taxation, where the marginal tax rates of the wealthy people in the 1950s was more like 90%, not 33 or 35%. And so, it's distributing if we distribute the responsibility, we distribute the benefits, we think about this as a collective kind of act and responsibility. We think about it as a patriotic act to make our country, our region, or our city better and wealthier and more equitable down the line. It is a positive sum game because everybody benefits from the enormous growth. And frankly, even the people who are paying 90% marginal tax rates didn't seem to be that worried about it while they're making money hand over fist with the growth of GM and US Steel or any of the other companies that kind of grew up in the wake of it. And so the question is, can we create that positive sum game that banks on kind of our ability to create wealth into the future that's going to help us by investing now in the things that are going to make us all better off down the line? And my answer is, I think there is. And it's a positive sum game if you see it as a way that we invest and we reap the benefits of those investments down the line. And hopefully we just do it more equitably this time than we did it last time, right?
Well, speaking of time, we're about to run out of it here, and I want to end with always a not so easy question. And the question will ask you to verify a fact. And the question is that northern cities are now our most segregated cities. Is that correct? Is there something left unresolved in those cities that southern cities were forced to reconcile in the decade following the Civil War?
So I will say that the answer to the question is yes. Northern cities are more segregated than southern cities, my account for that is slightly different, right? Because at least the older southern cities in particular, they were built and grew up at a time in which wealthy whites were comfortable having low-income blacks live around them because they were slaves. And the settlement patterns around those cities, I mean, they were narrowly segregated, but they weren't segregated in these big chunks of land like we have in the northern cities. And it was only after the Great Migration that the northern cities started to accept large numbers of minorities, and they'd already gotten comfortable with the idea that you organize yourself around ethnic enclaves, and then ethnic enclaves became ethnic and racial enclaves in most of these cities as they kind of grew out.
And as it turns out, it happened at the same time that we were expanding the geographic footprints of the cities by allowing the wealthy people in a very heavily subsidized way to go out and develop new lands on the outskirts of the cities in these wealthy suburbs, right? So as you brought new populations in, they were crowded into areas that were willing to accept them. Racial steering was happening all the time. And so that the processes that led to these heavily segregated cities were all part of kind of a flow of population, a flow of capital and public policy that just shaped the way we organize ourselves in that epoch, right? And so, and if you look at the next epoch, the next set of cities, where the cities that grew up around the cars, the Atlantas, some of the Sunbelt cities, those are pretty heavily segregated, but they're usually segregated not just within the boundaries of Atlanta, but within the boundaries of the metro area, right? And then Atlanta is heavily segregated from the metro point of view, and then economically segregated as well from north to south. So it's a complex story. Sorry, I didn't have an easy answer or a simple answer to it, but yeah.
Well, one thing I think we can take away from this presentation is that there are no simple answers to these very complex questions, but I think we also should take away that we need to understand the root causes of a lot of our present conditions. Let me end by thanking you very much for your very insightful and educational remarks. Let me thank our viewers for tuning in today. And let me thank Dr. McCarthy also for teeing up next week's speakers. We'll have Ms. Mullins and Dr. Darity, and they're going to speak on the issue of reparations, a topic which was asked in the question and answer session at just about every speech we gave last year, and we effectively skirted it. But we're going to deal with it head on next week by two people who have certainly made a distinct contribution in this area. And so, again, I'd like to thank our viewers. Please tune in next week at 3:30 on Wednesday, and it'll be a little different program. We're not going to have a presentation. We're going to have a discussion with two participants for the hour or so that we have with you. So it should be exciting, stimulating, and I look forward to it. And again, thank you, Dr. McCarthy, and thank all of you for tuning in. Have a good day.
Thanks.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua Institution's full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.